Our goals and dreams for the future reflect the things that are important to us, and they give people an insight into who we are and what we value. If I told you that laser eye surgery, a trip to Italy, and a fully renovated house were on my list of goals for the future, you would learn something about me. I wonder what you would say if I asked you what was on your list for the future. When almost any group of people is surveyed, inevitably the top things people hope for in the future are relationships, money, fame, or status. These are all things that are definitely valued in our kingdom of planet Earth. You might be surprised to learn that when Jesus was on the earth, he actually talked a lot about a different kingdom, a kingdom that he called the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. Now, when most of us think of the phrase kingdom of heaven, we probably picture something ethereal, far off, and futuristic. But when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, he actually used phrases like the kingdom of God is at hand or the kingdom of God is now. Jesus loved using stories to help illustrate how the kingdom of God is different than the kingdom of the world, and how people like you and me can actually participate in and live in the kingdom of God while simultaneously living in the kingdom of this world. We are going to look at one of those stories or parables today. Have you heard the one about the unconventional banquet? It's found in Luke chapter 14 and starting at verse 16. Jesus replied with this story. A man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servant to tell the guests, "Come, the banquet is ready." But they all began making excuses. One said, "I have just bought a field and I must inspect it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I've just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I want to try them out. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." The servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was furious and said, "Go quickly into the streets and alleys of the town. Invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." After the servant had done this, he reported, "There is still room for more." So his master said, "Go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges and urge anyone that you find to come, so that the house will be full. For none of those I first invited will get even the smallest taste of my banquet." Now, since this parable starts off with the words, "Jesus replied," that tells us that this story is being told in response to something, and we won't really understand the main point of the parable unless we understand the context. So we're going to go back to the beginning of the chapter to get a feel for what is happening here. We see in verse 1 of chapter 14 that Jesus has been invited to dinner at the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and he's observing the behavior at the table. To the world at this time, the behavior would have been very normal, very culturally acceptable. But Jesus isn't looking at the situation through the eyes of the current kingdom of first century Palestine under Roman rule. He is looking at it through the eyes of the kingdom of God, which means he is seeing things with a very different perspective. And Jesus has 2 things to say. He has something to say to the guests of the meal, and he has something to say to the host. Let's jump back in at verse 7. When Jesus noticed that all who had come to the dinner were trying to sit in the seats of honor near the head of the table, he gave them this advice. When you are invited to a wedding feast, don't sit in the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? The host will come and say, "Give this person your seat," and then you will be embarrassed and you will have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table, and then when your host sees you, he will come and say, "Friend, we have a better place for you." And then you'll be honored in front of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. When we look at Luke chapter 14, we see that not only is the parable about a meal, but the parable follows some other teachings surrounding a meal, and Jesus is actually having a meal while he is doing this teaching. So Jesus is sitting at the table, he is teaching about the table, and then he's telling a story about the table. The table carried huge implications back in first century Palestine, and so there are a couple of cultural things that we need to unpack before we can fully grasp what Jesus is saying. You see, in those days, there were very specific dining practices that took place during a hosted meal. Meals were actually used to publicize and reinforce social status, and seating arrangements were very carefully worked out and scrutinized. Think about it this way. It was kind of like the equivalent of saying a good word about someone in the workplace in order for them to potentially get a promotion, with the hopes that they would also help you out in the workplace at some point in the future. Or we could also compare it to responding to people on social media, sharing their business page in hopes that they might also promote your business page or your social media status. And so Jesus is noticing this kind of behavior going on at this meal. The etiquette and protocol of the day would have been very typical. This was the culture of the time. And typical of Jesus, he says something very counter-cultural. In fact, he begins to overturn all of the social protocols that these people would have known and followed concerning this major event of the table. Right as the meal is about to begin, and people are literally in the middle of selecting their seat or observing the seat-taking ceremony, Jesus says, "Stop. Just stop. Stop being so worried about your honor and your social status." He might as well have told them, "Don't try to get that promotion at work." What is Jesus saying here? Essentially, Jesus is saying that the things that the kingdom of the world sees as valuable, you've got it all wrong. You see, as we become more and more familiar with the kingdom of God, we see that God does not esteem and value the same things that the world does. Can you picture people maybe halfway between sitting and standing, suddenly not knowing what to do or what to say or where to look? And if that wasn't awkward enough, now Jesus has something to say to the host. Let's look at verse 12. Then he turned to his host. "When you put on a luncheon or a banquet," he said, "don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then, at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you." If you thought the whole seating chart thing was complicated, there's more. Invitations to meals were very carefully considered. You would only invite people who would enhance or at least preserve your social position. And you would also only invite people who would be able to return the invitation at a later date. An invitation to a meal was expected to be reciprocated. So the powerful and privileged would never invite the poor to their meals because A, it would endanger their social status, B, the person who was invited would not be able to reciprocate, so essentially it was a waste of money, and C, it would actually cause a great deal of shame and embarrassment to the person who is invited because they would be required by law to decline. So people would typically only invite other people who were in their similar social circle. But what do we see Jesus doing here? We see Jesus constructing a new social order. He says, don't bother inviting people who can pay you back. Don't be concerned with enhancing your social status or your financial status or how you are perceived among your peers. Invite the poor. Not only that, invite the blind and the lame. The blind and the lame would have been living in an area of the city that other people didn't associate with. These were people of low status. They were even excluded from full membership at the temple and banned from full participation in Jewish worship. They had restrictions applied to them because of who they were. And Jesus is saying, this system where the world is telling you who you should value or how you place worth in people, we need to drop this system. In the kingdom of God, the people that the world holds in low esteem, God actually sees and values. He ascribes worth to them and even holds them in high esteem. So we can just imagine what the atmosphere is like at this dinner. Jesus has dropped 2 social bombs. He's exposed the guests' motives and showed that they were placing value in worldly things. And he exposed the host's motive in using the world's measuring stick to gauge value in people. I think everyone must have felt pretty awkward and uncomfortable. And there's probably a really long, awkward silence. And finally, in verse 15, some guy can't take the tension anymore. Verse 15 says, hearing this, a man sitting at the table with Jesus exclaimed, "What a blessing it will be to attend a banquet in the kingdom of God." Basically, he is saying, well, I don't know about you guys, but I can't wait to feast at the banquet in the kingdom of God one day. Even if Jesus is saying we need to do these weird, crazy things now, at least we don't have to worry about these reject people when we get to the kingdom. Speaking about the kingdom as though it was something happening in the future, missing the main point that Jesus said over and over in his ministry. The kingdom of God is at hand. It's here. It's now. It's happening. It's not something that exists in the future after we die. The kingdom of God is now. And notice how Jesus responds. Oh, you want to know what the banquet in the kingdom of God is like? Let me tell you. And he launches into our story that we read at the beginning. Let's look at it again, and I think it will make a little bit more sense now. Jesus replied with this story. A man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. And when the banquet was ready, he sent his servant to tell the guests, "Come, the banquet is ready." But they all began making excuses. One said, "I've just bought a field and I must inspect it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I want to try them out. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." They were placing worldly value on things. Just like the people who were having a meal with Jesus were concerned with honor, promotion, and social status, the people in the story that Jesus told were more concerned with property, possessions, career, and relationship status than with participating in the banquet. All the things that we tend to want, relationship, financial security, experiences, status, those things aren't important to God. I'm not saying that he can't bless those things if we have them. I'm not saying it's bad to have them or that God doesn't want good things for us. But I'm saying those aren't on the top of his list. What's on the top of his list? Participating in relationship, a banquet, a celebration with us, with you, and with me. And who does he invite to this banquet? Let's read the last half of the parable again. The servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was furious and said, "Go quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." After the servant had done this, he reported, "There is still room for more." So his master said, "Go out into the country lanes, behind the hedges, and urge anyone you find to come, so that the house will be full. For none of those I first invited will get even the smallest taste of my banquet." The poor and the blind and the lame. Not the people who can reciprocate, not the people that have something of equal value to offer back to God. And then Jesus almost takes it one step further. The host says the people who lived outside the city, beyond the city gates, out in the country lanes, And these were the people who were considered unclean. Those who had leprosy or other conditions that would make other people unclean upon contact. And for the first time in 2,000 years, I think we actually understand this concept now. This concept of being unclean, of being in isolation, remaining 6 feet away from other people, covering our faces around other people, not being inside a room with another person. The guilt and shame and stigma surrounding a particular disease. For this host to invite the unclean to his banquet would be like saying he invited everyone who had COVID to his party. This was radical, upside down thinking. But that's who Jesus is. He is a God who values who we are, in spite of all the things that other people would say make us untouchable. And in his kingdom, God elevates the people that the world holds in low esteem. He wants the poor and the lame and the blind. He wants those outside the city, those that the world does not value. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. It looks like a world turned upside down. If you are someone who is already participating in the banquet, someone who is living their life at God's table, this story should be a reminder and a challenge for us. Do we have this same attitude in us that was also in Jesus, who even though he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to be grasped at. He didn't strive for status or power or recognition, but he lived this story out. He lived in humility. He emptied himself and poured out love upon everyone that he met, especially the people that the world or the religious leaders of the time would say were worthless or untouchable. Do we model this way of living? Can people say that about us? And if you are someone that the world is saying has no value, Jesus sees you. He values you. And he wants you to be at his table, participating in his banquet, living your life in celebration with him, not sometime later after you die, but right now.